Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's pretty relevant, I think, to a lot of what's going on in the world right now. We're going to be taking a look at some biblical prophecies about Syria.
Yeah, some fascinating stuff and how they might connect to what we're seeing play out on the world stage today.
Exactly. So we've got a couple of sources to guide our deep dive today. We've got an article that outlines 5 key biblical prophecies, and we're also going to be taking a look at a scholarly paper that digs into some really interesting details about how Hebrews 2.16 was translated way back in the day.
Should be interesting to see how all of that comes together.
For sure. So let's jump right in. This article kicks things off by highlighting 5 biblical prophecies about Syria. First, we've got the destruction of Damascus in Isaiah 17:1-3. Then there's judgment on the city in Jeremiah 49:2-27.
Okay.
We also have Syria's role in that end-time scenario described in Ezekiel 38:39.
Right.
And the idea that Syria's turmoil could be part of those birth pains that Jesus talks about in Mark 13:7-8. And finally, we have a more hopeful vision of peace outlined in Isaiah 19:23-25.
Yeah. It's quite a range of prophecies, isn't it?
Absolutely, and really speaks to the complexity of the situation and the different ways that people have interpreted these texts throughout history.
For sure.
So let's start with those prophecies about Damascus. Isaiah paints a pretty vivid picture of the city becoming a ruinous heap.
Yeah, and Jeremiah really kind of doubles down on that image with his description of fear and fire engulfing Damascus.
Yeah, it's powerful imagery for sure. But it's interesting because when we're talking about interpreting prophecy, it's not necessarily a one-to-one literal matching up of events.
Right. It's more about understanding those broader themes and messages.
Exactly. It's not about pinpointing specific events, but more about grasping those larger patterns of history and the potential consequences of certain actions.
Precisely. And so while Damascus has certainly faced some pretty heavy destruction during this ongoing conflict, it's important to remember that it is still standing. These prophecies, though, they could be seen as a way of prompting us to think about the fragility of power and that cyclical nature of violence that we see throughout history.
That's a great point. It's almost like they're meant to serve as warnings more than predictions. Like, hey, look what's happened in the past and let's learn from it.
Right. Like those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, kind of thing.
Exactly.
Now let's turn our attention to Ezekiel's prophecy in chapters 38 and 39.
Okay.
It describes this coalition, often referred to as Gog and Magog,
Right.
that attacks Israel from the north.
Mm-hmm.
And some people believe that this coalition could involve modern-day Syria.
Which is especially interesting given Syria's alliances with Iran and Russia.
Right. It's not hard to see why this particular prophecy is getting so much attention nowadays.
Yeah.
People are drawing connections between those ancient predictions and the current geopolitical realities.
What's your take on that? Do you think it's too much of a stretch to try and link those two things so directly?
Well, it's certainly tempting to want to connect the dots, especially when we see these powerful alliances forming in the region.
Right.
Now, Ezekiel, he describes this figure of Gog as coming from a land of Magog,
Okay.
which is often interpreted as representing a northern power.
Uh-huh.
And today, a lot of people view Russia as a major player in the Middle East, and its alliance with Iran and Syria could be seen by some as kind of fulfilling that aspect of the prophecy. But we have to be careful about not forcing interpretations onto the text that may not have been intended.
Right. It's like that saying, prophecy is history written in advance, but history is prophecy interpreted in retrospect.
Yeah.
You know, it's so much easier to see the connections once things have already played out.
For sure, it's hindsight being 2020 or whatever, but that's why it's important to approach these texts with a critical eye,
Yeah.
to consider different interpretations, different historical contexts, all of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So speaking of connecting prophecy to current events, we've also got Jesus' prediction in Mark 13:7-8 about wars and turmoil being signs of the end times. He refers to them as birth pains.
Yeah.
And with the conflict in Syria, along with all the other conflict and natural disasters that are happening around the world right now, it's easy to see why some people believe we're living in those birth pains as we speak.
It definitely raises some questions about the state of the world and where things might be heading. It's not just about Syria, it's that global sense of unease that a lot of people are feeling, that things are kind of shifting right now.
Do you think these prophecies should be seen as a cause for fear or more as a call to action? To try and address those root causes of these conflicts and work towards a more peaceful future?
That's a really great question. I think it gets at the heart of how we interpret these texts. Are they meant to paralyze us with fear? Or are they meant to awaken us to the urgency of the moment and inspire us to work for some kind of positive change in the world?
I'm definitely leaning towards the latter, especially when we consider a prophecy like the one in Isaiah 19.2325, which paints a very different picture.
Right.
Instead of destruction, it depicts a future where Assyria, which would include modern-day Syria, coexists peacefully with Egypt and Israel.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful image of reconciliation and unity, isn't it? Especially when you consider that long history of conflict in the region.
Absolutely. Do you think it's even realistic to imagine such a future given the current state of affairs?
It's definitely a challenging vision,
Yeah,
but maybe that's the point. It's not meant to be just this passive prediction, but an invitation to actually work towards that kind of future, to look past the current divisions and try to envision a different reality.
so even in the darkest of times, there's still a glimmer of hope and possibility. Now, while we've been focusing on these kind of macro views of prophecy, let's zoom in on a fascinating example of how interpretations can vary even on a micro level.
Okay. We're going to dive into this scholarly article that takes a closer look at a particular translation of Hebrews 2.16.
Oh yeah, I remember this one. This is the one that looks at how it appears in that ancient Syriac Peshitta version of the Bible, Ryan.
Exactly. And you know what's really interesting?
What's that?
The article talks about this writer named Shawdost.
Okay, yeah.
He actually accused certain groups of intentionally changing this verse and a few others to fit their own beliefs.
That's pretty wild to think about.
Yeah, it really shows you how much historical context and those theological debates can shape our interpretations of these texts.
For sure.
So, you know, the typical Greek version of Hebrews 2.16,
Yeah,
it emphasizes Jesus taking on the seed of Abraham, basically meaning he became human like us.
right.
But the Syriac Peshitta, it focuses more on the dominion of death over humanity and how that contrasts with death having no power over angels.
So essentially we have these two different readings of the same verse, each with its own set of implications.
Exactly.
The Greek version emphasizes Jesus' humanity, while the Syriac version kind of highlights that power of death that Jesus ultimately overcame.
Right. And Shadost's claim was that this Syriac reading was deliberately added later by a group with kind of unorthodox Christian beliefs.
So is there any way to know, like, which version came first or which is more accurate?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, we're talking about ancient manuscripts that have been copied and passed down through centuries.
Right.
It's inevitable that some variations are going to pop up along the way, whether it's by accident or, as Shadow suggests, intentionally.
It really makes you realize just how much work goes into understanding these texts.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as just reading the words on the page. You have to consider the historical context, the different translations, and all those interpretations that have emerged over time.
Absolutely. It's like peeling back layers of history, trying to figure out what the original author might have meant and how those words have been understood and reinterpreted through the ages.
It's almost like a detective story in a way.
Right. Trying to piece together all those clues and get to the bottom of what actually happened.
Yeah, like that.
So, you know, with Hebrews 2.16, we have these two different readings, and that question of whether one was a deliberate revision of the other just adds a whole other level of complexity.
It really does. It makes you wonder how many other passages might have gone through similar revisions over the course of history and how those changes might have influenced our understanding of the text as a whole.
It's something that scholars are constantly grappling with, and it highlights the importance of what we call textual criticism.
Hmm.
Basically, that careful examination of different manuscripts to try and reconstruct the most likely original text.
It's a good reminder that while we revere these texts, we should also approach them with a critical and discerning mind,
For sure.
recognizing that our own interpretations are always going to be influenced by our own perspectives and our own contexts.
Precisely. So the question becomes, how do we navigate all this complexity?
Yeah.
What does it mean for us as we try to understand and apply these teachings to our own lives today?
That's a big question. But it's pretty exciting, too, when you think about it.
Oh, yeah.
It means there's always more to learn and explore within these texts. It's not about finding one definitive answer. It's about engaging in this ongoing dialogue with these ancient words.
I love that idea. It brings us back to our discussion about Syria and those prophecies we were talking about earlier. We've got those prophecies of destruction, but then we also have that powerful vision of peace and unity in Isaiah 19.2325.
It's a good reminder that even in the midst of conflict, there's always that potential for something better.
Right, something beyond that current reality.
And maybe even those prophecies that seem kind of bleak on the surface could actually be seen as calls to action,
Yeah.
to inspire us to work towards a future where those more hopeful visions actually become reality.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's easy to get bogged down by the headlines and that immediate crisis. But these texts invite us to look beyond the present and envision a different future. One
Right.
where peace actually prevails, where enemies become allies, and where nations come together for the greater good.
Now that's a powerful vision.
Hmm.
And it seems relevant not just for Syria, but for the entire world right now.
Absolutely. I mean, we're facing so many challenges from conflict and climate change to political polarization and social inequality.
That's a lot.
And these prophecies, with their mix of warning and hope, can give us a framework for understanding those challenges and then working towards that better future.
They remind us that history often repeats itself,
Mm.
but they also offer these glimpses of a path towards healing and reconciliation and unity.
Exactly.
It's pretty inspiring to think about how those ancient words can still speak to us today,
I know.
offering guidance and wisdom as we navigate the complexities of our own time.
It really is. And it reminds us that we're all part of this much larger story,
Yeah.
a story that's been unfolding for centuries and that continues to unfold in our own lives and communities.
Wow, it really feels like we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
From the geopolitical situation in Syria to the nuances of biblical translation. It's a lot to take in.
It really is amazing how these different threads all weave together, isn't it? We started with those macro views of prophecy and international relations, and we ended up zooming in on how one single verse can spark literally centuries of debate.
And it all comes back to this fundamental question of how we should be reading and understanding these ancient texts today,
Right.
especially knowing that interpretations can be so fluid, like we saw with that example from Hebrews.
Mm-hmm.
Where do we even begin?
That's the real challenge, isn't it? I think for me, it starts with a sense of humility, recognizing that we don't have all the answers
Right.
and that our understanding is constantly evolving.
So being open to different perspectives, even those that might challenge our own assumptions.
Exactly. It's about understanding that the Bible was written in a specific time and place,
Right.
but that its wisdom can still resonate across cultures and centuries.
I agree. But how do we strike that balance between respecting the historical context and finding meaning for our own lives today?
It's like having a conversation across time, you know? We're listening to these voices from the past, but we're also bringing our own experiences and questions to the table. It's not just about absorbing information passively.
Right.
It's about actively engaging with these texts and wrestling with them sometimes.
And sometimes that means sitting with the discomfort of not having easy answers.
Exactly. And I think that's where a lot of people get tripped up. They want those clear-cut answers, a rule book for life. But the Bible often presents us with paradoxes and challenges us to think critically.
It's not just a straightforward set of instructions, is it?
Not at all. It's this incredibly rich tapestry of stories, poems, prophecies, letters, all woven together to offer this really complex and multifaceted view of faith and life.
So maybe it's less about finding the answer and more about asking the right questions.
I love that. Cultivating that spirit of curiosity and humility, approaching these texts with reverence, but also with a willingness to grapple with their complexities, that's the key.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to chew on. Any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with as we wrap up this exploration of biblical prophecy, Syria, and the challenges of interpretation?
You know, I would just encourage our listeners to keep exploring, to keep digging deeper. Read these texts for yourselves, seek out different perspectives, and don't shy away from asking those tough questions.
It's a reminder that understanding the Bible is a lifelong process.
It is, and that's what makes it so fascinating. There's always something new to discover, something to challenge us, and something to inspire us.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, everyone.